Good morning, everybody. I got 5 minutes to give you the history of Western Canada, so I better get at it. If you want to understand the regional dimensions of Canadian conservatism, you can look at it in an economic way, you can look at it in a political science way, but frankly, not meaning to offend anyone present, I think you should look at it in a historical way. It's to understand how people feel and think in an area, you really have to know their story. They think chronologically. And it's funny how even after the stories are less remembered than they were earlier, the attitudes that came with those stories or came from those stories persist in that area of the country. Now, to understand conservatism, or anything really, in Prairie Canada, which I've been asked to speak about and where I've lived all my life, well, actually, I was born in Ottawa. I never like to admit it, but I've lived in the prairies all the rest of my life, first Manitoba, then Alberta. If you want to understand our attitudes, I think you have to go right back to the beginning of political society in Western Canada. It was when it began, and I won't dwell on it because I don't have enough time, but it began with the Rupert's Land Purchase in, I believe it was 1869, when the Hudson Bay Company, which had owned Western Canada, if anyone did, for a couple hundred years, I guess, at that point, they sold it to the new Dominion of Canada. And the new Dominion of Canada sent out a governor. And the governor's name was McDougall. To get there, had to travel through the United States, I guess by railway, and then by horse-drawn sledge from St. Paul up to the colony at what's now Winnipeg, Fort Garry. And McDougall was a reputable Eastern gentleman and was traveling in whatever style one could in the winter in a horse-drawn sledge. And when he got to Pembina, which was the border from St. Paul up to Pembina, which was the border of the country, he noticed there was a welcoming committee there. It was some of the local people had come to welcome him as governor. And he, I'm sure, was pleased to see this until he noticed they all had rifles pointing at him. And they were the Métis. And they didn't want to be governed by some gentleman from Eastern Canada. They wanted certain guarantees and rights represented and guaranteed, and they hadn't been. Now, if you want to understand prairie conservatism, or even prairie culture, political culture, you have to understand that theme has persisted down through the past 140 years or so. You know, it first began when after they dealt with Riel and his friends. We then had the liberal business elite come out and run our railways and our grain companies. And what happened? We didn't like that. We created farmer movements, which began the cooperative movement. And then in the Great Depression, the next phase came with the Regina Manifesto and Tommy Douglas in part of the prairies. Again, a sort of an anti-elitist attitude which says we the people, we the community will look after our own affairs. In further west in the prairies, you had Aberhart up against the 50 big shots in Canadian business, especially the banks. You know, then we saw Deef in the 50s representing the average Canadian, you know, a conservative and yet very populist, rather socialist actually. And then, you know, Lougheed and Bennett and Lyon and Blakeney, the pinstripe socialist. Then we came to Preston and the Reform Party. And then Ralph and his cutbacks. And the theme throughout is an anti-elitist whiff of rebellion. That's conservatism in Western Canada. Don't tell us what to do. We'll tell you how we want it run. So to understand our part of the country and the conservative attitudes that came with it, I suggest you understand that. Thank you.